It is now my privilege to bring to you Mr. Dawson Kennedy and his paper Weapons of Mass Destruction.
I do have to inform you that there is a different draft in the pamphlet. It's an earlier draft when I was trying to go for a Hegelian style, so I've removed that style, and you won't be able to follow along as easily. So don't worry about that.
Oh, right. Yeah, Dawson, I gotta make sure I got that. You emailed me that version, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Remember what time you emailed that to me?
Tuesday morning.
Yeah. I remember this. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God. Mankind is against truth. He has fallen for a lie and lost his life in paradise. And the serpent does not want his offspring to know of their dead reality. Man is against truth because he believes the lie of Protagoras' humanism. Humanism is the thought of attaching supremacy of absolutes to man because man is thought to be the measure. Humanism wages war against truth because God is truth. Humanism replaces God's supremacy over absolutes and him being the measure. God is the measure because he is supreme, so the absolutes are already part of his being, not needing to be attached. Man has lost his life because he went against the instructions of God in the garden. This path for man's glory leads to death because it goes against the author and sustainer of life. The serpent wants mankind to stay dead with humanism because humanism changes the supremacy of the universe from God to man. When supremacy of the universe is changed, the glory given is changed. If humanism is believed, the universe is changed from glorifying God to glorifying man. So the serpent will have joy in the glory taken from God by deceiving his creation, man. Man needs to give supremacy to God, for it is God's creation, but man seeks to replace God's supremacy in creation for his own glory. When man replaces God's supremacy, man replaces God's order of law for idols. Man with idols is blind to the reality of the universe because he does not have the real measure of the universe. St. Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologia talks of the hierarchy where one can see the descension of God's being and law to man's mind and human laws. The hierarchy of Aquinas is the eternal law, natural law, then human law, and divine law. The eternal law is the supreme law of creation, which is God's reasoning. God's reasoning can be called the eternal law because he stands as the creator and ruler of the universe. Since God's reasoning is unchanging and eternal in its nature, like God, his reasoning is the eternal law. Natural law is the imprint of the eternal law on the heart of man. This imprint is reason. Human law is the governmental powers interpreting and dictating rules from the natural law. And divine law is the revelation of God through the Holy Scriptures, and it is the eternal law known through his revealing. Man has chosen to reject the eternal law and God's hierarchy. When man denies the eternal law and raises up idols rather than God, he loses his sight and life, for he is not the source of light, but just takes light and life as it is given to him. When man denies the source of truth in the eternal law, goodness, truth, and beauty are lost. Life is not true, good, or beautiful without God. Man loses reality of creation. It was very good. when he rejects God to create his own reality. Reality is that which corresponds to the view of God and that of creation, because he created reality. One who looks at God as the standard and his law will see reality. The lens to which man views reality is a pinhole to what there is. Man now sees his truth to be universal instead of knowing the eternal law. From this perch of false belief, man makes human laws based on faulty human reasoning. According to Aquinas, man could get to the eternal law by natural reasoning from the inherent imprint. If man sees his own intellectual corruption, he can come to God for truth. But man does not seek the eternal law, but pursues the raising of man through idols. Man wants his own glory, so he must get idols for himself to make him the new standard and law. Revolting against the truth of the eternal law, man worships, measures, and defines wrongly. Through idols, man runs opposed to the eternal law and the good, beautiful, and true reality in creation. Man worships, that is, believing and praising in false truths. As previously stated in reference to Aquinas, this idolatry is taking the law into man's own hands. Human law are based on man's faulty reasoning and not based on eternal truth. In Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, or True Directions Concerning the Interpretation of Nature, Bacon takes on four idols. Bacon's use of the term four idols refers to the doctrines that have fallacies of the mind which stop scientific progress. These fallacies are not merely scientific, but also stop man from questioning his own beliefs to know where he is rooted in the war for the eternal. The idols keep man from the appropriate self-awareness and skepticism of his own limited capacity and need for the eternal law. Bacon presents the four idols as idols of the tribe, idols of the cave, idols of the marketplace, and idols of the theater. These unquestioned idols are believed of man and are believed and promoted by man and society to deny the eternal law. In the examination of the fall of man and his thought from the eternal law, Bacon gives an excellent tool for dissecting the corruption of man's thought. Bacon's use of idols to show the corruption of scientific thought. Bacon uses the idols to show the corruption of scientific thought, but through Bacon and Aquinas, one can see the corruption of man's thought away from the eternal law. The idol of the tribe corrupts man's perspective away from the eternal law of God through the self-worship mantra of anthropos metron, man being the measure of all things. When man becomes the measure of all things, or the universe, it raises man to the absolute standard, or the greatest thing found yet in the perceived universe. Making man the measure is making him the ruler and makes men worship the greatness of themselves. This is not justified because of man's lack of godhood. He is not self-existent, omniscient, and beyond space, time, and matter to be the creator and ruler of it. Still, man looks to himself with no view of the eternal law. Bacon says man gains false security with this view. It is inherent to mankind to think that their own perspective is true. Quote, "Then idols of the tribe are inherent in human nature, and the very tribe or race of men. For men's sense is falsely asserted to be the standard of things. On the contrary, all perception, both of the senses and the mind, bear reference to man and not the universe." Bacon states the fact that should be obvious, but man still struggles with. That is, that man only has perspective of what man perceives, which is not the whole universe, so it is not the whole truth. Or it is just the view of truth perceived from the physical eyes and senses of man. Bacon goes on to say how the view of the universe is distorted like a bent mirror. Man needs to become aware that his view is just his own reality from his finite perspective. The idol of the tribe is the worship of the greatness of man. This idolatry does not take the scope of the limitations of man. This form of tribe idolatry leads to the incorrect belief that anthropos metron. Such a belief hinders a clear understanding of the universe because one cannot see the right perspective with a replacement of the eternal law. Truth becomes whatever the view of the individual man becomes. So, there is no longer a belief in one path, but truth is split among mankind. Belief in one's self-enlightenment rises as a worldview, and sincerity is raised on a pedestal as a new part of truth. For when man is the measure, then the new standard is how much passion he gives to his beliefs. The belief of the tribe which becomes man's preferences is because his view The belief of the tribe which becomes man's preferences is because his view is not universal and eternal, but individual. The standard of anthropos metron creates illusions from man's many perspectives. Then man takes this split truth as true and sees that there is multiple ways to God's eternal law. This is not the way of God. In Proverbs 20:10, it says, "Unequal weights and unequal measures are both alike an abomination to the Lord." With the complexity of many minds of man, it is then said that there is no way to the truth of God. Man chooses to reject the eternal law. When man sees the eternal law is not in man, he then concludes there is no eternal law. The tribe makes man the measure, therefore turning truth to opinion based on the individual. This makes man confused with what truth is, because man does not know the eternal law, but man with the imprint of the natural law seeks idols to replace the eternal law, to have his own absolutes. Mankind then becomes like the men in the allegory of the cave from Plato, all disagreeing fervently because of the rejection of the eternal law beyond their shackled view. The next idol that Bacon explains as being a source of human turmoil is that of the cave. The cave continues to keep man from the eternal law of God in the war that wages with worship. The cave immobilizes man from the eternal law by elevating the experience of man, making man keep to what he knows, to remain in comfort from experience and knowledge. This makes one's opinion open to fallacies. Personal preferences perpetuates perverted perceptions. The experience that is preferred comes from the individual and the culture around him. Quote, "The idols of the cave are those of each individual, for everybody has his own individual den or cavern, which intercepts and corrupts the light of nature, either from its own peculiar and singular dispositions, or from his education and discourse with others, or from his reading and the authority acquired by those whom he reverences and admires, or from the different impressions produced upon the mind. Heraclitus said well that men search for knowledge in lesser worlds and not the greater." End quote. The cave is man giving himself too much credence to nurturing and his upbringing and environment. The cave is the worship of one's personal sphere, environment, and preferences. What man believes of the eternal law is chosen from what cave he came from or went into. The cave is man's individual desires which have been influenced from what he has dedicated his time and work to, along with how the culture has influenced his own interests and work. Man has a love for pursuing meaningless smaller worlds of his own interest and not the broader common one he inhabits. This is a distraction in the war of the eternal law, where it could be said that Screwtape the demon is winning. C.S. Lewis in the book Screwtape Letters tells the story of how demons are matched to torment men. One of the chief strategies used by demons is that of simple distractions, present wants such as food and urgent tasks, so they will never think of the eternal law. The cave causes man to worship what is known and has been taught in his endeavors and culture. This worship leads man to stay in his experience and comfort, never questioning his reality. For the man of the cave, his mind, work, and culture are comfortable. Comfort keeps self-skepticism distant, and culture creates a lifestyle one can't escape nor wants to escape. Like the lotus eaters, never to reach home, replacing the eternal law with the eternal inertness. The third idol that Bacon explains as being a source of human trouble is the market. The idol of the market is man rejecting Aquinas' natural law, which is the eternal law imprinted on the hearts of man. The idol of the market says the natural law that exists in man's conscience is not from the eternal law. Instead, the market claims the natural law is just man's speech and feelings. So man tries to find the best speech for himself, not from God. Man worships speech and knowledge of the natural man. So man gives into being overwhelmed by words and not questioning claims or credibility of man's natural law. The market, quote, derived as if from the mutual claims or credibility of man's, from mutual agreement and association of the human race, which I call the market on account of men's commerce and partnerships. For men associate through conversation, but words are applied according to the capacity of the ordinary people. Therefore, shoddy and inept application of words lay siege to the intellect in wondrous ways, end quote. Man does not question the content of speech, unaware of motives, or willfully ignorant of political conflicts of interests, not operating on truth. The market worships complexity of speech, and to worship complexity allows one to be overwhelmed with words thought to contain meaning because of amount, not questioning the content being poured out because of the incapability to process. With the market idol, man is fooled with thinking that vast content is regal and an aspect of truth. This is the saddest out of the four because it puts truth on a belief of foggy-mindedness and not being able to understand the truth. The market says since man's natural law is not found and there is no eternal law, man should be enamored with complex speech to explore reality. The final idol that Bacon explains as being a source of human upheaval is the theater. The idol of the theater halts man's progress to the eternal law by worshiping vigor of philosophy, along with mass acceptance of dogmas instead of accepting the divine law. The idol of the theater is philosophy. Man accepts the revelations of philosophies as true because of their place in society, such as being argued by charismatic politicians like Alcibiades. Man accepts and worships beliefs because of their common place in society, not questioning that it is a revelation and opinion of man. Man thinks since a philosophy is well known and believed by many, it must have been put through trials and have a sturdy standing on truth. But man never actually questions the theater ideas for himself. Quote, lastly, there are idols which have crept into man's mind from various dogmas of peculiar systems of philosophy, and also from the perverted rules of demonstrations. And these we denominate idols of the theater, for we regard all systems of philosophy up to now, received or imagined, as so many plays brought out and performed, creating fictitious and theatrical worlds. The theater idol may seem like the cave in some sense, but the cave idol is accepting what is known and staying comfortable in experience and environment. The theater is well accepted because of its familiarity and civilization. On the other hand, the cave is accepted because of its intimate experience in the individual's life. The theater is a rejection of the revelation of God through the divine law and replaces God with the supposed revelation of man through philosophy of man's mind instead of God's mind. Man mistakenly believes in the mind of man over the omniscient mind of God. The theater idol promotes comfort, as opposed to promoting experience, as with the cave idol. But the theater, in group acceptance, personal and familiarity of the mind of man and his ideas. Man is given into rhetoric and the words of man over God. When man doesn't question dogma, truth is not known and boundaries can be crossed. If man does not question the popular philosophy, then man will end up like the slave soldiers of Persia instead of Leonidas and the Spartans fighting at Thermopylae. The slave soldiers saw the might of the Persian Empire and sold themselves without stopping to reflect on the nature of freedom. But the slave soldiers were quick to go with the dogma and wealth sold by Xerxes. Following man's worship against the eternal law is the spirit of self-aggrandizement. It is the very essence of man's being. Man indeed measures all things by himself, intellectually, emotionally, and ultimately by his will, volitionally. Opening with intellectually takes us back to Francis Bacon and the first idol of the tribe. A quick restatement is that man hits trouble when he thinks nothing is beyond him and tends to make anthropos metron. Intellectually, man assumes his perspective as true, but his truth is eye level. It is the perspective of where the man stands and where the eyes are laid. Secondly, man measures emotionally. One can see the emotional measurement from the character of Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov. Ivan rejects God and his eternal law from emotion. He says, quote, I want to forgive, I want to embrace, I don't want more suffering, and if the suffering of children go to the swell sum of suffering which was necessary to pay for truth, then I protest the truth. It is not worth such a price. Ivan is discussing the question of God's existence with his brother Alyosha, giving his reasons for not accepting God, primarily the suffering of children. The key point in Ivan's argument is not that he cannot accept God and his ways. Ivan, the intellect, can't accept... The key point in Ivan's argument is that he cannot accept God and his ways. Ivan, the intellect, ends his discussion not with denying the truth, but saying he can't handle the truth for what it is. Ivan, using his feelings to be the measure, rejects the eternal law. So it seems like man is helpless to know of the absolutes from God, but man only wants the benefits from absolutes, but not sovereignty and standard. Man ends up torn because he has to put worship into man's intellect over the eternal law. Man cannot handle the implications of the eternal law. Quote, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Man is self-aggrandizing. He wants justice, but his way of justice. He wants mercy, but his way of mercy. Man questions God like Ivan, using the tribe idol to make anthropos metron. He replaces true reality from the eternal law to a corrupt reality of man. Lastly, man defines his own truth, not based on the eternal law, but based on his own desires. Man choosing to define his truth is like the cave idol, where man goes by his preferences and does not acknowledge his self-appeal. In an etymological breakdown, the clear focus in the meaning of definition is to put a limit or boundary to something, to fix authoritatively. God is the only one who defines and gives definitions and fixed authority, for he is the eternal law and the defining line. Man goes against the real definitions from God, wanting his own authority, and instead of likeness of God, wants to be as God is. In paradise, the first attack of the serpent is against God and his law, his word. Quote, hath God then said that of the fruit of all garden trees ye shall not eat? The serpent questions the law and definitions laid out by God. In reflection, the prefix for definition, D, can mean to complete, though the actual prefix here seems to be a contraction of des, a prefix meaning to evade or excuse. The serpent says, is that really what he said? The serpent changes the term like the market idol. He misquotes and lies about what God says to deny the eternal law. Then once God and his word is discredited by the serpent's speech, he can go on and deny what God is really doing and how God just doesn't want you to be wise and knowledgeable like he is. Following the same etymological logic, the meaning of decide is to kill the alternative or eliminate another choice. Thus man has unfortunately chosen to eliminate the choice of of worshiping the one true God in spirit and truth. Man decided to go against the eternal law in the fall, and he says man will now define what is good in his own eyes, not trusting God's definition. In paradise, man knew of the eternal law. God puts before man the option, choosing life or death. Man choosing death. Man chose death when he rejected the eternal law and the author of life, for God said, "You shall not eat, for on the day you eat of it, you will surely die. If you disobey life, you are for death." Man is at war with the eternal law since the fall and continues to worship, measure, and define with idols, foregoing Aquinas' hierarchy. Man wants himself to be the eternal law and what he says to be the definition for his own glory. Man does not know the idols of worship, the standard by which he measures, or the line of where he defines, will never make him the eternal law, but leads to death. Man is tricked with anthropos metron through the idol of the tribe. Man is fooled about the greater world by his cave idol preferences and comfort. Man is lost in the knowledge of the eternal law by the selling of words at the market. Man falls for the dogmas of the theater by its popularity. Man defines his own truth with man in mind, opposed to God, who is the eternal truth. The best way to know reality is knowing the standard. Man does not know the mind of God, but by divine law of his inspired writings and the incarnation of the eternal law, man can know reality. When man gets to the eternal law, he has found the goodness, beauty, and truth he lost, because he is with the source of life and light again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy. Throughout the paper, you've contrasted the concept of anthropos metron with that of Aquinas' eternal law. And you seem to be painting a picture in which true knowledge comes from submitting to God's eternal law rather than attempting to seek knowledge from man's own impression of things. And yet, could it not be argued that God, in creating man in his own image, has created a being whose one of his tasks is to see the world in his own eyes? And it seems like the first example of that would be God calling on Adam to name the creatures. God doesn't come to Adam and say, "Here are the names of the creatures I have given you, go and give it to them." He says, "No, you go and name them," putting Adam into a place of profound creativity and authorship, wherein he looks at the elephant and says, "This looks like an elephant." Okay? Kind of using his own judgment. And it also seems throughout the scriptures, God gives us many commands that have to be filled out using our own intuition and our impression. God tells us to be modest, but he does not give us clothing outlines in the back of this Bible to tell us, this is what modest clothing looks like. There's a lot of things in which we have to judge in accordance with the measure of our own insight. Mm-hmm. So, do you think that holding to the understanding of God's eternal law does away with all responsibility or requirement upon man to come to judge using his own intuition and his own insight?
No. The intuition would just be under the eternal law. So even in the example you gave of man naming the animals, after the instruction of God, through his purpose and his reasoning, the eternal law, so he's using his intuition after an instruction from God. So that's different from using his intuition to go against God and create the fall. So I would say you can use your intuition after instruction of God, but not against the instruction of God.
Sure, but I find it interesting how sometimes Christians seem to think that morality is a little bit like a sort of Euclidean system based on the Bible. You know, you ask somebody, okay, should you be modest? And they say, okay, well, I'll go try to find a Bible verse now that tells me whether or not these pants are modest or not. And they can't do it, and so they say, oh, okay, well, there's nothing. We can't say anything. And yet, to make such a determination isn't in part saying, you know what, that looks to me this way, and to say, nope, I don't have a Bible verse I can quote you about, you know, how long your short should be, but that looks to me immodest. And to say, that's part of Christian life, is having the capacity perhaps to use anthropos metron. You have to see things. And that ability to see or to judge in accordance with your impression is part of what God may have commanded us to do. So,
Well, yes, man should be the measure of man, but man shouldn't be the measure and the end purpose of the universe. So I think the key point that's missing is of man wanting to be like God as God is. So it's one thing to say, well, man is man, so isn't man anthropos metron? But man being the measure of man being the supreme, so man should know his place, but man, that's including his lack of supremacy.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking back to Genesis where it says, you know, God created the animals of the earth and he saw that they were good. And I can't remember if it says he saw that they were good or he said that they were good. I think I've read it different in different translations. How much is it man's place to look at certain things and to say, this is good? Or is that only God's place?
I think you could do an argument that it's not man's place to say it is good, because there is actually very little that man does. God tells man name, and he creates the trees, and God tells, this is trees good for eating, and these are trees for beauty, and do not go to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it seems like that God is the only one who can define good, and that you should just align yourself with God, and then through your life you can just say what is good and what is not good, because really I don't think in Genesis there's any place where, as I said, man isn't the source of light or life. He just takes what is given to him. So there's just lots of instructions given to man in the garden of God walking with man.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the state of man is ignorance, even in the garden.
Mm-hmm. A lot throughout your paper, you spoke of kind of the idols of the tribe fairly negatively in contrast to seeing the eternal law of God. And as you're talking about it, I was thinking of how difficult it is to see things apart from the judgments of the tribe. You know, right now, I sit here and I think, I understand what's safe. I think I understand what safe is. Well, tomorrow morning I will go to church, and my church community is fairly different, and there's a lot of people there that have a different understanding of what safety is than I do. And when I sit down in that group, I will probably all of a sudden start rethinking everything I've done for the last 4 days and say, am I crazy? This is totally unsafe. And, you know, as much as I say, you know, I have my definitions, I've thought things through, I have my reason, I seem to be a pretty fickle creature of the tribe. And yet, is that really different from the way things should be? Should we not have, you might say, those around us, the culture we're in, should that situation not shape our understanding of the definition even of words?
So you're asking, should the culture around us not shape how we think.
Well, you give Bacon's examples where he talks about how we tend to have the culture around us shape very important words. We get ideas from our culture, and you spoke fairly negatively of that. I'm just wanting to ask the question again, and just put forward, why isn't that supposed to be the case? Why shouldn't you be influenced in those around you? Even though I feel, to me, it makes me feel fickle as a person, that my ideas can change so easily by the context around me. And I don't like it, but I'm wondering, is that not the way we should come to our ideas, is by seeing those around us and being influenced by them?
Well, I think it would just go back to that the tribe is an idol, and so it's trying to replace the supremacy of God. So if the tribe was pointing to God, then that'd be fine. I mean, a tribe or the church, if it's pointing to God, then yes, you should try to change your view. But just overall in man's tribe, since it's just an idol taking away from the supremacy and the glory of God, that's why you shouldn't trust the tribe idol.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy. Other questions?
Anna.
First off, lovely paper. I have not read Bacon, so read it though. But this is fairly new to me. So I'm just going to ask some clarifying questions before I get to my main question. So, to me, the idol of the theater and the idol of the market seem very similar in that they were both very influenced by society. That the theater gives man dogmas and doctrines, and in the market, from what I could tell, that natural law is just men's speech and feelings. How they, to both of them, seem to be in regards to how man processes truth. So, could you define the difference for me?
Yes. So, the marketplace versus the theater. Yeah, the philosophy. So, the marketplace doesn't have to necessarily be philosophy. It can be any communication at all. So, it's much more broad than man's popular worldwide philosophies. So, it could be your neighborhood communications that are taking you down a path versus the American philosophy of individualism, that would be the theater, versus your specific group could be the market, where you're just trading bad ideas.
Okay. And so my main question is rather similar to where Mr. H was going. So it seems to me that when you talk about all these idols, the idol of the tribe seems to be the most prominent in that it has anthropos metron, which would be the standing point, the cornerstone of humanism. So given that, I know that there is the eternal law and that there's a consistent truth. However, we also have our perception of truth that uniquely colors how we perceive it. So how do we know truth when we see it? How do we determine what is the eternal law?
Well, I would say the eternal law is you have to have a Christian worldview based on believing historic beliefs of that that the Christianity is a historic belief of apostles during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. So it's a very historic religion with multiple authors compared to other religions. So then I would say your belief in Christianity and your belief of the nature of God, so the eternal law, the nature of God, and how you view it through your belief that the Bible is inspired writings. So that'd be the eternal law.
Thank you.
Heather?
Good job. I liked your paper. I really liked your elaboration on the different idols that Bacon presents. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the idol that is most prevalent in our culture today, or do you think that it just varies from person to person? Like which one affects them?
Yeah. Well, for like our American culture? Yeah, I would say probably, kind of like my last paper. De Tocqueville talks about individualism, where America just has a healthy amount of individualism compared to others where the self is raised so high and it just eliminates communities. So compared to other places, a community or a family could be raised as an idol. I don't know what you would call it. Yeah, the family would be raised, but instead it's in America, the individual. Yeah.
Okay, so like, which of Bacon's idols though, like, do you think most directly relates to
Oh,
that in your
okay.
opinion?
Well, then tribe, because man being the measure, except it would be like individual being the measure. So I guess the tribe, just because humanism.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Great paper, by the way. I enjoyed it. I was just going to ask. So when you talk about the cave idol, you define it as sort of the idolizing of basically what is familiar, like sort of what you grew up in, this sort of sphere of what your family has told you, and what maybe like the church that you go to, what you learned from the one church that you've gone to. So I just wanted to ask, do you think that growing up in a Christian family and going to the same church, do you think that that could sort of turn into a cave idol, or that you could have, you could sort of idolize this Christian environment that you've always been raised in and not question anything outside of that, outside of that environment that you've been raised in? Do you think that Christianity could become a cave idol?
I think it could be. If you're not thinking about the nature of God as revealed in Scripture and how that applies to the nature and depravity of man, then yeah, you're just enjoying your community that you were raised in as an idol. Hans?
First of all, I like your hair. Second of all, your paper was amazing. It made
Thank
me
you.
so happy. I don't know why exactly. I think it's because, first of all, Bacon's 4 idols are really helpful mentally, and I love how you lay it out together with Aquinas, and then progress to kind of. It feels to me like you took what I was trying to do in my paper on a conceptual level and actually did all the groundwork of explaining all the ins and outs of limitation. And as I was writing my paper, I knew there was something I wasn't doing. It's this, where you categorize everything. It's so good. I kind of had the same question as Sarah, but I guess maybe a little more specific. So, to a person that kind of grows up, as I've seen so many people do, and there are so many people, college I'm going to, and other Christian colleges that fit this description. They grow up as a Christian in their family, in their church, and they're confident in their worldview, and they get to college, say, or maybe even Great Books class, and they read about the idol of the cave, and they say, "Oh my gosh, my faith is a lie. I've fallen into deceit," and they turn their back on Christianity, or they're at that moment where they realize everything I've been thinking is just the kind of like the breakers of this ocean of Christian truth that just keeps beating on me, but I haven't been hearing all this other background noise, and now I realize that my faith is just propaganda, that it's been battered into my head until I can't think of anything else, but it's not. There's no other basis for it. How would you respond to that person? Because there are people who leave the Christian faith in that situation.
Yeah. I would say it's sad, and probably the main thing missing is in the Christian community is that it's too, basically every community of too man-centered, because even if you're raised in a Christian community, the real awakening is when you realize that the focus of the supremacy and the glory in the end is God. So you can believe all these Christian truths, but you can still be selfish. So as you say, where they realize, oh, they've just been in this cave, then I guess I would say, even then, they're still thinking of themselves, because they're thinking of how they've been lied to, and they're thinking about how their worldview is not true, and I would just talk to them about the nature of God then, because they never were thinking about the nature of God. They were thinking about Christian community, and now they don't like the Christian community because they realized they actually didn't believe it, they were just in it. So I just talk about the nature of man and the nature of God, I guess.
So that their subjective experience does not disprove.
Yeah.
Okay.
Joseph?
Good job. I really enjoyed it. Kind of like an intro to bacon, I guess. In your paper, you have you set up this scenario where man is at war with truth, and it's kind of a war between man's different ways of coming to his own truth and absolute truth of God. And so I wanted to ask, in your opinion, what would you define as absolute truth? I think you mentioned in your paper that God is absolute truth and that his morals are like the absolute, and his reasoning is absolute truth and the eternal law. Right? That's what you say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then how, as Christians, are we supposed to pursue that truth in a day-to-day life? Just in general, how are we to pursue that truth? And could we not make use of some of these idols that you say, like philosophy, to kind of discern truth, or communication between men, or talking and discussing? Can we not make use of these just so long as we don't idolize them?
Yes, you can make use of philosophy, but it needs to be in below. It needs to fit within the eternal law. So if it's against the eternal law, if any of it raises man higher than whatever his purpose is as creation from dirt, then you shouldn't take it, because that's not true. So if it raises man, then you shouldn't take it. But if it's to promote philosophy and communication, to promote God, then yes. And you wanted me to define truth?
Well, you kind of already.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Veronica.
All right, lovely paper. It was very fascinating hearing this paper, especially after Hans's, and you both have whetted my interest for future LGBT authors. So my question is kind of in two parts, and I will try to make it as brief as possible. So one, you talked a lot in your paper about the phrase anthropos metron, which is, man is the measure. And the word anthropos could mean man as an individual or mankind at large.
Mm-hmm.
And in the four idols, there are two, I think, that you talk about that pertain more to man as an individual, which would be the tribe or the cave, and two which pertain more to society, which could be the idol of the market and the idol of the theater. So would you say that anthropos metron is really the underlying theme of the four idols?
I don't think Bacon intended it that way, but he was intending it for how it's stopping man from progressing. So, if anything, Bacon would probably say that these are ways that man needs to stop doing so that man can continue to progress. But I was using anthropos metron, for humanism, for all the idols, basically in singular and all of mankind. So for my version of Aquinas, Bacon idols, yes, but for Bacon would disagree with me.
Okay, and second part, I suppose. So you would define humanism as mankind finding truth in himself?
Yeah, rather than materialism, which is just the belief of only materialism, well, you could have humanism believe in supernatural, but it's just humans is the greatest thing. So that's why I did Protagoras humanism.
All right, thank you.
Josh?
Thank you, Dawson. I really enjoyed your paper. I appreciate the breakdown of Bacon. I don't remember him very well, so that was much appreciated. So after reading Hans's paper, I can't help but think of Hume and maybe think of how Hume might respond to your paper. And real quick, let me read from your second paragraph. It's just defining truth. You said that man perverts human law into coming from man himself and says instead of truth as that which is corresponding to reality as it is perceived by God, instead that truth is that which corresponds to reality as it is perceived by man. So it seems to me that the central issue here is whether or not there is an eternal law, thereby being a God-given law. So don't you think that by presupposing that God is a sufficient and possible explanation in your definition of truth, that you're kind of presupposing that which you set out to prove, thereby making this somewhat circular?
Are you saying that I was presupposing God's law to prove God's law?
Yeah, somewhat that in order, you start out with the definition of truth, right,
Mhm.
so that you can continue on from there.
Yeah.
But your definition of truth somewhat includes that which is kind of the primary topic of confusion here. That being whether or not there is an eternal law and God. in
Yeah.
general.
I would say I wasn't trying to prove truth. I was just defining truth, and I assumed truth. So I would agree with you. I was assuming truth and showing idols that takes us away from truth. So I assumed that the eternal law was God because of his supremacy. So I wasn't trying to prove there is an eternal law or anything like that.
Okay, because it seems to me that that's the main reason that people look at man as somewhat being the measure, more like Hume saying that the more intellectually honest position would just be to say that we don't know. We don't know whether there is an eternal truth or not. All we can go based off of is our passions and whatever reason we can muster. So saying that there's a sufficient explanation like that of God might be taking a step further than we actually have any right to do.
Yeah, I assume the existence of God and his supremacy to argue that he is the standard.
Okay.
Veronica?
Okay, kind of following off of Joseph's question from a bit earlier, would you say that only as long as we place truth in God and we don't find truth in ourselves, that like our perception of things, what our familiarity with things, philosophy, and like what our culture is saying can be tools to see truth, but when we see those things in the light of we find truth in ourselves, that they become idols?
When what becomes tools?
Yeah, sorry, that was kind of confusing. But would each of the idols that you laid out not be idols only so long as our search for truth lies in God and not ourselves?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because tribe and community is good, and communication is good of the marketplace, and thinking and philosophy is good, and your environment you've been raised up is good, but when your view of what the end goal of the universe and supremacy and everything is based on philosophy or communication or your upbringing or just the tribe, then yeah, it's
Okay.
bad.
So all those things are goods when they're in their proper place.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy. All right, so everybody go ahead and stand up and get yourself moving a little bit here. So if you go ahead, start off with me. Here we go. Ba-doo-ba-doo-ba-doo-ba. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mi, ni, xi, omicron, pi, rho, sigma, tau, phi, epsilon, phi, heap, c, omega, ba-doo-ba-doo-ba-doo-ba, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mi, ni, xi, omicron, pi, rho, sigma, tau, phi, epsilon, phi, heap, c, omega, ba-doo-ba-doo-ba-doo-ba.
Alpha, beta, gamma.
Delta epsilon.
Titus.
Nixie.
Omicron phi.
Epsilon phi.
Ipsy.
It's Naya, not you, Veronica. All right, here we go. Utos garigapisen. Utos garigapisen. O theos ton cosmon. O theos ton cosmon. O stidonion manheni. O stidonion manheni. Ethoken. Ethoken. Inapaso pistevon. Inapaso pistevon. Isafton meapolite. Isafton meapolite. Olechizoin. Ionian. Jacqueline Jaskula, lead us. Utos garigapisen. O theos ton cosmon. O stidonion manheni. Ethoken.